Hello, welcome back to the GEOG 701 Quantitative Spatial Analysis video series. At this second video, we're again continuing with the process of writing the paper for the course as well as writing mini journal articles. While it is not the first section that appears in the paper, the first section that you're to do as the milestones for the course is the data section. So I'll start with that. And to be clear up front, the reason for that is the biggest impediment people have to having a successful paper in this course is not having their data, not knowing what their data is going to be until pretty late in the semester. So I have this as the first thing instead of the intro and lit review because it's best to be thinking about the data and to have that nailed down first so that you know you have that to work with. So here's what would often be in the data section. So a data section. In many cases, if it's not a common understanding, there will in many cases be a study area section, especially for studies, papers on small areas. To take an example from physical geography that is common for WVU because WVU is in part a manager of the Fresno Experimental Forest. I'm sure that people in the forestry department know all about that, but when they're submitting a paper to a broader audience, most people do not know about this forest. And so they have to explain, here's where it is in the state of West Virginia. Here is some important aspects about either the climate or the different species compositions or the topography, the hydrology. So different aspects may be relevant or irrelevant to the study at hand, to your specific paper. You present those parts which are relevant. Once you have the study area presented, and if it's something that's known, it may not be a full dedicated section. You might just say, kind of, that towards the outset of the data section, my study area is the counties of the United States. And that would then be enough for something that's well known like that. You have to point out in your data section what your observations are, what your features are. In short, what are you actually studying? To say, I am looking at counties, so it's aggregated data at the county scale. Or I'm looking at individual surveys, so I'm looking at individuals. It could likewise be in a physical geography setting, tree by tree. Or it could be looking at a larger plot by plot to say what is the exact unit of study. This is important because as we might see, again, it depends on the exact techniques people choose, the readings that end up there, scale becomes important. Where if you are studying, and this will definitely come up, if you are making studies about counties, with the data from the US Census, for example, you cannot draw a conclusion about an individual who lives in that county. That's called the ecological fallacy, because in public health, when they say ecological data, they mean aggregated. It doesn't mean they're talking about trees and plants and animals and that sort of thing. So if I find, and there were some cautions at the outset, especially of the COVID pandemic, people saying, look, counties with a higher proportion of minorities seem to have higher COVID rates. In many cases, though, just because, in that example, it actually was the case that the members of the individuals in those minority communities were getting COVID at a higher rate. But if we're just looking at counties, we didn't know that for certain. It could actually have been other people living in those counties. The example given in the paper, and we'll see this later in the semester probably, is this problem was first elucidated by a study looking, say in the mid-1800s, looking at German, or Prussian actually, this is pre-unification for Germany, Prussian states and suicide rates. And they found that in the Protestant dominated states, the suicide rate was different, I believe it was higher, was different from the suicide rate in Catholic states. But that doesn't mean it was actually the Protestants who were committing suicide. They made the argument it could actually have been Catholics who were in the minority and felt persecuted. So therefore, just because your data is the county scale or the state scale, your conclusions must be at that same scale. And the same general caution applies if you are looking at plots within a forest versus individual trees within those plots. That's a long way of saying in your data section, you have to spell out what your observations are and justify that choice with respect to the research question. So that's why that whole long discussion was important. You have to justify your choice based upon how it affects the research question and helps you answer the research question. You also have to explain and justify your choice of variables or attributes that you are using in your study. And that has to then be, again, justified with respect to the research question. Something that affects this do you standardize the data? So are you looking at, say, the number of COVID cases or the rate of COVID cases in a county? Have you done other data processing? Those choices will have to be explained and justified in your data section. in some cases, this item about outliers is sometimes present, sometimes not. Where to say, are there outliers that you removed from your analysis? So one example for West Virginia, we might want to, especially if we're looking at COVID rates in certain times of the year, let's go with early January, we may wish to, if we're trying to understand the general dynamics across the state, we may wish to exclude Monongalia County. It saw a big spike right about that time. Why? That's when the students returned to campus. Because that is when students returned to campus, bringing COVID in from wherever they had been, there's a dynamic going on that doesn't apply to the rest of the state. And so I could then make the case that Monongalia County is an outlier and therefore should be removed from the remainder of the analysis. You could likewise make an argument that, no, this is still important. There are still other factors at play, and so I choose to keep it in. That gets to, in many of these situations, there isn't necessarily a very explicit right or wrong answer. What is important is that you are able to defend and justify the choice or choices that you make. And that justification or defense shows up in your data section. The last thing for the data section that I will put here, because it is something that is left out quite frequently, if you are using secondary data, that means you got it from someplace, whether that's the Census Bureau, whether that is data that was developed and used in a different study and you're reusing it. In many cases, if it's a data set that you can, say, download from the internet, like the US Census data, there is a citation provided for you. There's a citation for things like the National Land Cover Database. And you can go and say, here is where I got my data. And you have a citation. If it is secondary data, that needs to be present. Likewise, if it is data that was collected for some other study, and you're using it here, you need to cite that other study. The data itself may not be publicly available. So having say a data set specific citation might not work. If, say, somebody did a great study over in the sociology department and you want to use their data and you said, hey, Dr. X, could I do a secondary analysis of the data from your paper? And they say, sure, here it is. You cite that initial paper. So you need to make sure that your data source is cited, just as you would cite any other resource, journal article, book, what have you, that you have brought to bear in the study of your problem in your research paper. So those are what I would typically be looking for within a data section, mainly the citation, as well as in each of these choices. You describe the choice you make and you justify the choices you make. So that is that for the data section of a paper. As always, if you have questions, feel free to contact me in any of the ways, whether in class, by text, by email. Please reach out. it's hard to understate how important that is in a situation where we are not meeting in person. So if you have questions, please reach out, and I will see you at the next video or the next class period.